Mhm.
Have you sent it?
Yes, I think it will take a minute,
Okay.
maybe to land, and I'll try.
So, Malika Bahovadinova is a research associate at the University of Amsterdam. Her work is on political anthropology and the relation between state and society. She explores the everyday politics of migration governance, and she's focusing also on citizens' engagement with state control and their agency in asserting a political role in authoritarian contexts. She works also, is it still, are you still part of the International Studies program at later, or have you finished?
No, I'm a lecturer at Leiden still.
You're a lecturer at Leiden University. So let me check if it has arrived. Yes.
Yeah,
So
good.
I'm opening it.
Thank you so much. I'm still trying also on my end to see if it will work. No?
Can you see it?
Yes,
Okay.
perfect.
So, Malika, the floor is yours.
Okay.
Let me know when I have to change slides.
And I'll okay to the recording. Yes,
Yeah.
we're all set. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. My apologies again for time confusion. It's a pleasure to have an opportunity to present today at the Ethnography Online Seminar Series. So the paper title today is Between a Knife and the Law, Bureau Legal Engagement in Migration Bureaucracy in Tajikistan and Russia. So the paper is based on my larger research project where I study bureaucracy of migration management in Tajikistan. And as it turned out, you cannot really study migration bureaucracy confined to one country. So it spanned quite a bit, my research field sites. And maybe we can put the next slide now,
Hmm.
just to briefly introduce you to the overall project. So the project was studying the introduction of global migration management practices in Tajikistan. And I focused on a network of individuals, it's civil servants, employees in international organizations, employees in local and international non-governmental organizations, based in Tajikistan and Russia, but also I had frequent trips to Europe as well. If there are reporting procedures to the UN, I would accompany my research participants to Geneva, for instance. And I conducted fieldwork both in Tajikistan and in Russia. I started it in 2012, and the bulk of the work was done in the first 2 years, then with subsequent visits both to Tajikistan and Russia. And I completed the project, I completed research kind of side of it in 2020. And in the project, I focused mostly on the bureaucracy and the kind of like ideational practices of the bureaucracy and the politics of representation. So thinking with much of the research done on statehood and on anthropology of the state. Here I was focusing on how, like, if we will reverse the framework, the fantasy of the social was produced. So how do we come to understand social groups? And it's finishes up right now, the research in the book manuscript, Making Migrants, International Migration Management in Tajikistan. And the topic today is based on one chapter in this book manuscript. And we can now move to the next slide. And I will begin my talk with a very brief vignette to introduce the overall topic, but also to kind of outline the major predicament that my research participants had. And I'll start with the story of Vadim. So Vadim was a young lawyer, and he was in his 30s, early 30s, working for a non-governmental organization in Russia that worked directly with migrant workers. And before I met him in Tajikistan, I have heard quite a bit about Vadim from his friend and also colleague, who I called Sasha, another human rights lawyer. And Sasha told me the following story about Vadim. And he also mentioned that Vadim is very influential, has an influential voice in forming migration management agenda in Russia. And he also told me this following story. As narrated by Sasha, Vadim received a phone call from a group of migrant workers from Tajikistan, who it turned out had been exploited. They were working for free for an entrepreneur in Moscow. The latter had taken workers' passports and threatened to pass them on to police. And if they would run away from the construction site, and from what Sasha says constituted modern slavery. The group of men continued working for the entrepreneur, but in the meantime, they also found the phone number of the organization where Vadim worked. They got in touch with them and with Vadim in particular and explained the situation. So Vadim basically was in contact with them, and he decided to go to the rescue, but he went to the rescue alone, carrying a knife in his pocket. So when he met the worker's boss, he explained him the legal consequences of his actions and managed to persuade him to return the man's passport and let them go from the site. So when I met Vadim in, I think it was, 2019 in Dushanbe, where he came to deliver a workshop for local human rights lawyers and for local state officials, he explained me a little bit of a context to the situation. So he went alone to the worksite with a knife because the foreign workers exploited on the construction site were, according to the law, violating the rule of their stay in Russia, правила пребывания в России. If the police had gotten involved, all of them would have been afterward deported, since they were violating migration law in Russia. Because Russia law does not really provide explicit legal protection for victims of slavery or exploitation, in this situation, workers were equally punishable alongside the man who was benefiting from their free labor. So Vadim knew these details very well, and he didn't want to risk police involvement. Instead, he took a knife, and in this case, he didn't need to do anything with the knife, but he said he kept it just in case if the situation would turn dangerous. And instead, he talked about the law with the so-called entrepreneur. So in these regards, Vadim's case and Vadim's story is representative of the kind of limits of the legal possibilities in Russia. Maybe we can move to the next slide. In Russia, the country which attracts more recently about 3 to 4 million of migrant workers who work predominantly in construction field and also in service sectors in Russia. And Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, 3 former Soviet states in Central Asia, have since 2000s became the major labor providers for a host of post-colonial reasons, of course, but in particular, the Soviet legacy of the cotton monoculture in the region. Tajikistan was least developed Soviet republics in the region, and it more than others felt the consequences of the collapse and also preceding reforms, which led to the country's civil war between 1992 and 1997. So the labor migration from Tajikistan to Russia started relatively earlier than other citizens from Central Asia, and it was quite in the footsteps of the country's civil war, and as gradually Tajikistan earned the reputation of being one of the most dependent countries in the world. More recently, like the proportion, the ratio of GDP, of course, it's very kind of a political topic on its own, but it's estimated that 30% of the country's GDP is basically comprised of remittances. And this mobility, visa-free mobility between Tajikistan and Russia, which is, of course, created in the framework of the Commonwealth of Independent States, also led to the highly kind of volatile and violent system of post-entry controls in Russia. So most of migration governance, when it comes to in Russia, is very much concentrated in what I call in my project, like the infrastructure of state. So upon arrival, this is when all of them kind of expensive and complex bureaucracy stats of legalization in Russia. And of course, we can observe similar dynamics in this context to what migration scholars observed in Europe or in the US. Yes, that the law, migration law is developed in order to produce illegality and kind of expand the field of deportability. I'm thinking about Nicholas Dejanova or Karashenk wrote with regard to Russia in particular. In Russia, there is also like stop and frisk searches, which are quite routine in major cities in Russia, where often racialized citizens are picked up by their appearance. Violent police raids also on places of work and places of living are very common experience in migration. But this is not like all of the bureaucracy that regulates the mobility. There is also this very much transnational kind of network of institutions, which includes various state and non-state institutions of sending and receiving states. And in this case, it's created, or not created, but expanded to produce the ordered migration, what appeared to be very much unorganized mobility in the region. And very often officials would use such terms as stihiyная, that chaotic mobility. And again, unlike the migration response in Europe or in the US, where the goal is to deter and to push away migrant workers, in these circumstances, the goal of the bureaucracy was to organize, kind of create a very much Weberian dream of total legibility. Everyone knows where everyone is and for which purposes people came. So the bureaucracy was kind of created to do that, to create legibility and increase legality amongst migrant workers. And in this paper today, I will be looking at them as a subset of this bureaucracy and at the major kind of subgroup in these institutions, and that the role of the human rights lawyers. And I'm going to pay attention to their bureau legal engagement in this bureaucracy and what kind of effects they are anticipating with their labor. And in doing so, I want to highlight this relationship between legal domain and bureaucratic domains, and how human rights lawyers were engaged as a kind of intermediaries between Russian migration legislation and also migrant workers and their experiences not only with the law, but also with state institutions in Russia. And human rights lawyers were very essential in the bureaucracy because of the overall emphasis. Maybe we can also move to the next slide. The overall emphasis on the importance of the Russian law and the overall goal of increasing legality in migration. And we're all familiar, of course, with the figure of the illegal and the clandestinity that migration evolves. And here, in a similar vein, in this context, bureaucracy was also basically putting a major emphasis on reducing illegalities in migration. And in this bureaucracy, human rights lawyers worked both as like human rights activists and lawyers, but also as migration officials, like bridging these two gaps. And this bureau legal engagement, I suggest, generates scales of bureaucratic expertise, reinforcing also inequalities and institutional differentiation across geographies. And they were practicing a form of like non-state bureaucratic labor. And in doing so, they were both reproducing but also challenging Russian legality and the understanding of the legality in Tajikistan. So methodologically, I'm inspired by Zamindar's historical account of post-colonial partitioning between India and Pakistan. And in her work, she explores this very much relational politics of post-colonial separation in the introduction of the permit system and passport system in both India and Pakistan. And Zamindar carefully documents kind of the back and forth in the formation of the policy and how two new states were forming bureaucracies and institutions in relations to other states' documentary practices. So in doing so, they were also reinscribing colonial kind of separations and reinforcing the religion as like kind of major difference and the marker of difference in both of these state institutions. And working with human rights lawyers, I would like to further this mode of evaluation to analysis of the bureaucratic practice itself and as forming in this very much relational kind of everyday state making. Working with lawyers also, I suggest that transnational cooperation reshapes the meaning of what is considered to be bureaucratic authority. How do we define the needs of citizens? What do they need while they're in migration? And how certain understandings of distinctions are also produced. In particular, I would like to also think about how expertise comes to be regarded as vital or particular kind of expertise. And I was working with legal scholars and their kind of like their take on this relationship between law and the bureaucracy or the intersection between the law and bureaucracy. And in particular, Robert Burns was exploring this kind of increased bureaucratization of the legal work. And he was suggesting that it was eroding the spirit of the law, that lawyers have to do all this paperwork and bureaucratic labors, and thus they had less time to practicing the law. In our context, however, rather than treating bureaucratic labor as kind of antagonistic to their legal work, human rights lawyers were basically treating these bureaucratic labors and their engagement in the bureaucracy as integral to their legal practice, but also human rights values. Maybe we can also, next slide. Legal scholars also very often looked at the law as the kind of evolving within the society. Yes, the evolution of the law and how legal instruments are developing. But what if the law has been provided? And this is the kind of question I'm asking here in this paper. If, as Holiday and Morgan suggest, law is the lifeblood of a structured system of authority within a society, then we need to think about the law, about the power as well and authority in the context of transnational bureaucracy of migration management. Because the kind of law human rights lawyers were promoting in Tajikistan is very much of particular interest. And this is not the human rights laws or the human rights standards which the Tajik state adopted, but rather the focus in this bureaucracy was on mastering Russian law. So Russian law was the main aspect of authorization in this bureaucracy. And the kind of framework to this was if migrant workers know the law, they can follow the law, and thus they can be legal in Russia. That's the kind of formula which was very much dominant in the bureaucracy. And the human rights lawyers or the lawyers in general were seen as like the best conduits to do that. They know the law, they master the law, and they can explain the law to migrant workers so that they follow the law. This basically was integral in defining population needs. So the lawyers were deciding what kind of laws migrant workers need and also attuning their work very much to the Russian legal field. And I suggest these processes are important to look at because they have the consequences for our understanding of locality, expertise, and also authority. And the opening story of Vadim with his knife shows how Russian migration legislation is structured and developed to produce migrant workers' illegalities. At the same time, when Vadim talked with entrepreneur, he talked about the law, and he was explaining that the entrepreneur was basically could be held accountable because he hired undocumented workers. So it's not that he caused the illegalities in migration, but because he was hiring undocumented workers, and thus he was subject to there were legal consequences for doing so. Vadim, working with cases of usually unpaid salaries or illegal detentions, often encourage migrant workers to litigate in Russia. And they both were practicing lawyers and taking on cases. And both Vadim and Sasha, they were frequently noting how important it was to litigate to promote the rule of law in Russia. And migrant workers were particularly encouraged to do so. And both Vadim and Sasha also invested a lot in bureaucratic labors. And for that, they traveled a lot to Central Asia to deliver various workshops. And the participants in those workshops were often local lawyers, local human rights activists, and also local state officials who were working with the Tajik Migration Service, delivering information to migrant workers. So when I met Vadim in 2019, he came to Dushanbe, the capital of Tajikistan, to lead two events. And the first of those events was like a kind of technical workshop, which was organized for lawyers and low-ranking officials within state institutions who work directly with migrants. And during this technical workshop, Vadim was presenting a very kind of different interpretation for the legal awareness, for this idea that migrant workers needed to know the law. Here, he focused more on the violations by Russian law enforcement and migration officials of migration legislation. So the nature of the information which he was delivering in this very much small workshop was kind of different. It had different underlying premise rather than the dominant migration management paradigm, yes, that migrants don't know the law and thus they fall into illegality. Here, Vadim kind of inverted the logic of his work. And during this event in particular, Vadim was translating specific legal provisions into the actions which migrant workers needed now to take because the law was changing. And discussing racial profiling, he said that the police had the right to stop people on the streets only if there was a reason for suspicion, yes, as per Article 12, the law on police. So Vadim said migrant workers must consider whether this was whether there was a reasonable cause for them being stopped by the police. And more importantly, they also must check if the police officer stopping them was actually carrying jeton. The person, if a person was off duty and did not have the right to check people on the streets, they would be missing this jeton. And jeton is a kind of identity disc which police is carrying when they are on duty. Vadim also noted, like often police officers or students from academies, police academies, were stopping migrant workers and detaining them also in violation of their own institutional rules. So in this regard, Vadim was participating firsthand in this very much institutional or state life of law in Russia. And he was aware how already punitive migration legislation was being violated also by local officials for the purposes of corruption and extortion, of course. This was the information that he believed was important to distribute in Central Asia. Aligning with Ivan Ilyich conception of a professional, Vadim was defining the needs of the population in Tajikistan around the needs of the Russian legal field. And however, there was also important caveat here. in human rights language, if workers knew the law, Vadim was arguing, then they would be able to discern the violations of the law by Russian officials and police in Russia. So they could challenge these illicit practices of officials. In other words, migrant workers were meant to contribute to the rule of law in Russia by holding Russian institutions accountable for legal violations. So it was like an inversion of the dominant discourse in this bureaucracy. And human rights lawyers were very much promoting this kind of narrative about the abusive state apparatus. But there was also in Tajikistan, the bureaucracy, migration management bureaucracy, also attracted lawyers because pre-departure orientations in Russia was very much structured around the knowledge of the Russian law. It was naturally assumed that lawyers are best positioned to deal with migrant workers. So they were very much, in many regards, the first kind of point of interactions between officials and migrant workers. And Vadim and Sasha both saw their colleagues in Tajikistan as the primary conduit to distribute information and thus prepare people for Russia. Paralleling Nanyakas Mathur's ethnographic account of the state life of law, officials in this regard were organizing the bureaucracy of state life of Russian law in Tajikistan. And in fact, knowledge of the Russian law, its frequent changes, and the wide range of labor-related practices was very much considered to be a major asset in Tajikistan as well. And we can move to the next slide. We have this and the following. I think we already looked at it, maybe the legal expertise in migration governance. The next one, yes. And here also, I would like to just highlight a case of Firuza. Firuza is a local lawyer who was based in Dushanbe, and she was working for the International Organization for Migration. And Firuza was very much providing a very different bureaucratic labor to that of Vadim. And in many regards, Vadim's expertise required people like Firuza, who were firmly embedded in the hierarchy as both consumers, but also producers of the local knowledge. And one bureaucratic instrument that Firuza was in charge was also aiming to disseminate the Russian law to Tajik migrant workers. Yes, in practice, it was school pupils at schools, students, it was people at the airport. So in practice, it meant very much like everyone, like whoever happened to be in the place where pre-departure orientation was being delivered. But Firuza was in charge of the hotline. And the hotline was set up by the International Organization for Migration. And according to the design, it was meant to provide information about the Russian law to the public. And in the first years of operation of this hotline, it was very quiet. So nobody called that number. It was like a very black, like big black brick. It was sitting by Firuza on her desk, and it was very quiet. Things, however, changed in 2013 when Russia overhauled its migration legislation. And it wasn't only the migration legislation which was changed, however, also the technological capacity of capturing various kinds of administrative violations into what was called locally blacklist, черный список. So it was a very dynamic database where all of the individuals, whoever could be enrolled by 11 different agencies in Russia. So there were different agencies who could put names into that database. And if your name is in there, it means you are blacklisted from entering Russia from 3 years to indefinitely. Most of the people were blacklisted for 5 years for various administrative violations. However, there were also permanent kind of bans on entry to Russia. And at the time when this system was launched in 2013 and 2014, Firuza was operating the hotline, and she was caught up in this rush for information, and hundreds of people were calling this hotline. And with this phone, with this hotline, Firuza was learning also about this expanding deportation regime in Russia. And I'll just also read out a vignette where she was providing a service to migrant workers. So it was in March 2013 when Russia was just introducing these changes. A caller to the hotline asked Firuza to verify if he was on the blacklist to re-entry. And this individual, in fact, already knew the answer because he was sent back to Tajikistan upon arrival to Russia. So the caller nonetheless wanted to learn for how long and for what reason he had been blacklisted. Firuza asked him, like she asked a number of questions. And then in the end, she's like, have you been issued any fines in Russia? And the caller was working as a taxi driver. And he said, yes, of course, for traffic violations. He had 2 fines, but he had paid them in full. And she informed him that in Russia, if Russian citizens violate, for instance, traffic law, then they pay fines and administrative charges dropped. This was not the case with foreign citizens. If you violate their migration law, and I'm quoting Firuza here, even traffic laws, then you will be enrolled into the list. And she advised him not to even think about going to Russia for, for several years. So in this process, Firuza was kind of accumulating her knowledge about Russia's deportation regime, migrant workers' experiences with laws and policies, and was providing a sort of palliative legal care, the legal knowledge which explained the situation but could not address the situation legally. And by managing this hotline, Firuza was also in contact with other lawyers who were working in this field, and she also knew Vadim very well. They would often get together for workshops, discuss specific legal cases, and she was basically performing this very much non-state bureaucratic labor, but doing very much different work than that of Vadim. And it is important to attend on how the performativity of a professional was transnationally organized. And Firuza in her work and her colleagues also in Tajikistan were judicially following Russia's migration legislation. And this is what was distinguishing them as having expertise in this bureaucracy. And Firuza was very often attending trainings organized by people such as Vadim or Sasha, sometimes were also coming to deliver training. And this was also further cementing Firuza's authority. So in this hierarchy, the knowledge position lawyers who had like this very much first-hand experience and the first-hand knowledge about migrants and their encounters with the law as having like authorizing knowledge, which was important for officials in Tajikistan. And one of the organizing principles, and we can move here to the next slide. And this bureaucracy was with this subset of a group in this bureaucracy was, of course, human rights. Yes, that it was important to promote human rights and international obligations, and this is why human rights workers, human rights activists were present in this bureaucracy. And this idea that they were promoting rule of law posits that everyone benefits when the laws are followed by governors and governed alike. And the label of human rights lawyers was following very much similar logic. migrant workers' well-being was sought in the adherence to and the knowledge of the law. So the same bureaucracy also sought to encourage workers to litigate, of course, in order to improve the underlying rule of law in Russia for migrant workers as well, for the benefit of migrant workers, but also Russian citizens. And this belief was quite widespread amongst lawyers, and it seemed contradictory, especially to those of us who kind of knew that the law and human rights and the lawyers like perfectly knew the law was designed to produce illegalities. The law was designed in a way that it's almost impossible to be legal, or it's almost impossible to know that you are legal in Russia. And I was always asking lawyers, so like, why are you promoting the system that produces illegalities in migration here? And I posed this question also to Samira. She's another human rights lawyer in Tajikistan, and this is how she replied to me. And I'm quoting her. On the one hand, I'm sure they should know the basic rule of legislation. Do those laws work or not is a completely different question. And I asked why, and she continued, because even if the laws don't work, in cases promoted by Muhammad, they force those laws to work. On the other hand, if we look at the situation from the angle of international law, then Tajikistan has the obligation under the convention. It should have a system of pre-departure orientation so that Tajikistan prepares migrant workers. So migrant workers know the law and they have free access to information. So this is how she responded to my question as to why they were promoting Russian legal field in Tajikistan. And Samira was a young legal professional. She was working as a manager in Dushanbe. She started her career as a pro bono lawyer practicing, providing direct services to the population, but then she became a manager and was working as like an NGO manager running labor migration project. And in her answer to my question, she first pointed to the delivery of information as the kind of act of state reification, because Tajikistan had signed the International Convention on the Protection of Rights of Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families. It also signed the International Labour Organization's convention, which is called Migration for Employment Convention, number 97. So in this regard, Tajik state institutions were delivering information as a mean of like implementing these conventions and the provisions specified in this convention. But she also referenced Muhammad, yes, as a kind of person who forces these laws to work. And for her, it was this potentiality for activism in migration, which was important. And this is why she was explaining me, this is why we're doing it. Like, why are you asking even such questions? Like Vadim, she saw place and an importance of the legal activism in Russia, and knowledge of the law in this regard was a kind of metaphorical knife. On the one hand, one that was needed to make officials and not migrant workers follow the law. This was especially clear in Samira's reference to Muhammad, clearly an outlier, and she called him an outlier, who, according to her, was able to force the laws to work in Russia. Muhammad, and he was known as migrant activist in this bureaucracy. And it should be said that he received his law degree in Moscow, and he went there from Tajikistan, and where he could study law, but also work and earn money for his law degree, to pay for his law degree, something that he could not do in Dushanbe, for instance. And Muhammad, together with a group of lawyers in Russia who worked as drivers, sellers, or construction workers, they set up a WhatsApp group where they were taking on legal cases. And Samira saw the activism of these lawyers and as influencing the overall legal landscape in Russia. And it may be useful to consider Samira's comments about Muhammad in light of Sarah Friedman's and Chan's research on strategies of legal recognition in amongst LGBT communities in Taiwan. Analyzing the practices of constructive parenthood, they considered how LGBT parents and their legal consciousness encompasses awareness of the current laws and the kind of limited range of legal possibilities that was available for them to recognize their familial practices in the existent legal landscape. So in that case, the heteronormativity of the law in Taiwan meant that LGBT citizens were allowed to normalize kind of their gendered norms within this framework of the law, building their social and economic lives, and also anticipating future potentialities of the law, that the future law will address the kind of diversity of LGBT familial practices. Here, these potentialities rested also with LGBT activists who were promoting their recognition and advocating also for changes in the law. In much the same way, Samira saw the value in activists such as Muhammad, who would work with punitive laws within this very much limited range of legal possibilities. But at the same time, there was no activism amongst these lawyers to promote legal changes in Russia, which pertains also to the notion of post-colonial legality and the kind of sacred nature of the law. The law is there, so the law might be unjust, but it's already there. So there was no really work within the bureaucracy trying to promote different kind of legal changes in Russia's migration legislation. At the same time, Muhammad also never appeared in migration bureaucracy in Tajikistan in the roles occupied by people such as Vadim or Sasha, or even Firuza and Samira. He was firmly embedded in Moscow and in the local imagination as migrant activist and not as a lawyer. And it also pertains to the local kind of hierarchies, that the fact that Muhammad was a Tajik speaker and not a Russian speaker like Samira or Firuza, for instance. So there are different kind of also local class-based hierarchies which were defining some people as having expertise and some people as lacking proper legal knowledge. We can move maybe to the next slide. And I'll conclude with basically a few remarks about the kind of aspirations human rights lawyers have in migration governance and how they explain their work in this field where migrant workers very often taught to align with like expectations of receiving states. So in this instance, the lawyers in migration bureaucracies, they were kind of repurposed the awareness-raising paradigm to endow Russia's punitive migration legislation with the possibility of hope and also potential movement towards the rule of law, even if the law is unjust. And according to this logic, to discern the violations of the law, local officials and migrant workers needed first to master the knowledge of the law and its particulars of misapplication in Russia. So migrant workers needed to know the law not only to implement its provisions, but also to identify when the law was violated by the border police, by law enforcement agencies, by the Russian Migration Service. And in contrast to the dominant migration management discourse about workers' unpreparedness for migration and their need to learn the laws, and as Daramir Rudnitsky suggests, also obedience along the way, human rights lawyers had reinterpreted the paradigm of unpreparedness, injecting their own vision of an abusive state apparatus in Russia and reframing the role of legal awareness as a tool to litigate against state institutions and not necessarily to follow the law. So this approach flipped upside down the normative kind of roles in this bureaucracy where migrants were the possible violators of the law, and the state authorities were those who are enforcing the law. And it was kind of aiming to redress some of the damage done from the violence of migration controls. In the process, however, lawyers were also producing separations. So Vadim's expertise was considered higher than that of Firuza or other human rights lawyers who were firmly emplaced in Tajikistan. And at workshops, it was Vadim and Sasha who were the experts. Muhammad was a migrant in this bureaucracy. So it wasn't really necessarily the proximity to the law, which and to the action where the law was taking place, which defined the expertise, but also authorization was geographically and ethnically or racially distributed in this situation. But at the same time, the bureaucracy was not only producing this institutional differentiation, but also the meaning of expertise was also redefined in the local context. So the citizens' needs and risks were basically defined in Russia. And the human rights work at the same time was reflecting these overall limits in the migration law that was often defined by Russian officials, like what citizens in Central Asia needs is defined by the kind of imagination and complaints that were voiced by their colleagues in Russia. The metaphorical knife of the action, or when necessary, a real knife that Vadim carried, could carve out a space for social improvement and expression of solidarity. The search for the public good through legal and extra-legal bureaucratic means underlines the belief in the capacity of bureaucracy and also bureaucratic labor to generate hope for social change. And this is how lawyers saw their own activism in this kind of environment. The key to securing this public good then becomes the knowledge about Russian law and expertise in identifying and also countering its violation. It is here that the Russian Federation's punitive migration legislation, which often in the local vernacular was analyzed as draconian, had a high currency in Tajikistan, a currency that local officials also needed to accumulate through their encounter with highly authorized Russian and international experts. And in the process of producing prepared migrant workers by improving their legal awareness, local officials, however, were also simultaneously were reinscribing their own lack of technocratic knowledge because it wasn't them who had the first-hand experience of their social group, but rather they were learning about this group from like the mirror of an official in Russia. Okay, I think I'll stop here. I believe I went a little bit over time.
Thank you very much,
Yes.
Malika, for the presentation. Very interesting. And I will open the floor for questions. And I have a couple to start the discussion. Some are pragmatological. For example, where do study law these lawyers? In Tajikistan or in Russian? Or do they start in Tajikistan and they do MA studies, for example, in Russian? And if they do that, how they feel as migrants themselves, even if they are privileged migrants. Also, when they are in Russia for study, for example, you said that some of them they study in Russia. Do they volunteer, for example, to help their ethnic Tajik migrants in any legal procedure there as a form of activism? And a final question. All the description of this bureaucratization of migration reminds me of what we are discussing also in the case of refugees and humanitarianism. So we are seeing the development of a migration industry
Mhm.
field where people are doing are finding jobs, are becoming employed, and they are making careers.
Yeah.
So and this reminds me something that an old research by Ruth Mandel in Kazakhstan, and the people in Kazakhstan working at NGOs, and there we had the production of a new class emerging.
Mhm.
And this is also a form of colonialism, a
Mhm.
colonial and transnational class that of experts.
Yeah.
So if you want to comment on that.
Okay. Thank you, Alani, for your questions. So, with regard to the first question about where do they study the Russian law, and especially when it comes to Russian to local Tajikistani-based lawyers, and most of these lawyers received their law degrees in Tajikistan, and they were kind of prepared to operate in the legal field in Tajikistan. So this is where you learn national and international kind of legislation, which will affect your work. Yes, and there was also two tracks, like you either study civil law or the criminal law, but it was based on the Tajikistani national legislation. Here, these lawyers who were kind of trained for operating in the Tajikistani legal environment have to accrue the knowledge of the Russian migration legislation. And that legislation, I have to tell, it's a roller coaster. It never is steady. So it changes every few years. There is an overhaul of legislation. And the law itself is not just one law on entry and exit of the foreign national. This is the kind of main law. But the laws that span from it for traffic violation, residency requirements, like requirements for registration, medical checks, then there is a whole bureaucracy of becoming a migrant. To become a migrant, you need to pass Russian test, you need to pass Russian history test, you need to go through medical examinations. So there are whole sets of kind of requirements also to even become a migrant in Russia. And the law is quite vast. And the human rights lawyers or the lawyers who were based in Tajikistan, they were learning about it mostly from their colleagues in Russia who were coming to deliver information about the law. And they also were following the law online. So if Russian state is planning on changing the law, they were also judicially following. So was the law passed? What was changed? What exactly was changed? How it will affect? So this is how many of them were trained locally. And in some instances, like the instance of Muhammad, who received a law degree in Russia, that is more of an unusual kind of scenario, because most of the lawyers, it's a very class thing, because the lawyers who receive law degree in Tajikistan, they come from particular families, they come from particular kind of backgrounds where you can have the privilege of studying the law. Muhammad went to Russia first to join his father to be a migrant, yes, to work in migration. And then he enrolled at university there and started to study the law. So it's a very unusual scenario. And I think his treatment as a migrant comes from this background, because he doesn't really come from this class of a Russian-speaking urbanite population. Yes, there is also very much Soviet legacy to who is considered to be an expert and professional and who is not. And Muhammad comes from the rural area, so he was remained in imagination as like an migrant activist, never as a lawyer, never an equal to lawyers within the bureaucracy. And Muhammad, in that case, yes, he set up his WhatsApp group and he was volunteering and providing legal information. But most of the lawyers who were based in Tajikistan, were not traveling to Russia for work. And it's here where it's something what I also explore more in detail in my book, where you do have a population who you're supposed to help and who you're supposed to work for, but you don't have the access to this population. So it's not this very much traditional bureaucracy where an official captured a social group and is in control of social group. Here, the social group is in Russia, and local lawyers don't have often the means to travel to Russia to observe what's going on. And I remember one of them was invited to a workshop in, I think it was in Poland, but he went through Russia. And he said, okay, and I decided to go and to try to become a migrant myself, because just I had 2 days in Moscow and I wanted to check out these procedures on myself, because we all teach these things to migrant workers. I want to see how it's done. And it was him who came and he said, you guys don't understand what's going on there. You don't understand that the system is produced, like is designed to produce illegalities. It's like it's impossible. And he also raised the question of like treatment as well. But very often the lawyers were quite separated. Like Tajikistani-based lawyers were very much in Tajikistan, and more like transnational expert kind of roles were implemented by people such as Vadim, but also international human rights lawyers as well. And with regard to to your second questions about the industry, and there is quite a bit of literature also written about this development of the industry and the focus on migration governance as the kind of generating income, generating access to resources. In Tajikistan, I specifically use the term bureaucracy, and not industry, and I'm doing it for 2 reasons. First, here, like it's one of the poorest republics, yes, in Central Asia. The bureaucracy is starved for money. So if you have Tajik state institution, the Tajik migration service, it does not have funding for implementing programs. It has funding to keep people on the books, yes, to have these people delivering some of the programs. But at the same time, it's not a rich bureaucracy. It doesn't have these kind of spectacular sides of the border. Yes, if we look at the US context, or the side of the sea and the front tax action, and it doesn't have this like the industrial kind of breadth to it. It's a very small network of individuals who know each other, but who also are not really they don't like have lots of funding. That's why calling it an industry, to me, it seemed a little bit far-fetched in this context specifically. But I also call it bureaucracy for a second reason, and I think in places like Tajikistan or like in sending context, you can see the kind of more of an ideational work being done, like how needs and risks of migrant workers are construed and produced. There is more of a labor about talking about migrant workers, talking about what they need, because it's a sending country. We need to understand who they are, what their risks and needs are, so we can provide the information. And this is what I found very much fascinating, because on the one hand, these are citizens, but on the other hand, these citizens are in Russia or somewhere else where, and you rely on your colleagues from Russia to define what their problems are. And the problems apparently were that they don't know they don't know law, they don't know Russian language. They look different. They dress like in traditional dress. So these problems were defined very much not by local officials, and this is the kind of contradiction which I wanted to explore, and why I'm using the term bureaucracy. rather than industry.
Yanni?
Yes, thank you, Malika, very much for your presentation. It made me go back to the 1990s, where there was this dominant discourse globally about human rights, but with regard to the minority rights and indigenous people's rights. And of course, a lot of things that you talked about brought me back to the 1990s and 2000s and the literature about these issues in Southeastern Europe. What I'm trying to put together some of my thoughts, if I understand it correctly, and then get to a couple of questions to you. So actually, you already mentioned this. It seems to me, if I understand it correctly, that legality is not a fixed status, right? It's an ongoing process. And it seems that the whole thing, as it is played out there, it produces illegality as a starting point. And then you have the legal experts who are the mediators. They have the legal expertise, and they are the ones that mediate and somehow contribute to producing new subjects, right? So this idea of the what subjects are produced within this discourse is something that seems to me interesting, and I would like you to tell us a few things about it, because I see that, I mean, it's migrants and experts, the kind of subjects that are produced, right? And I was also triggered by the concept of pedagogy that you had in one of the slides, which seems that it's not just simply informing migrants about the law, but it's more like a technology of subject formation, again, in this case, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, good. So I get it right. And lawyers in this kind of practice are the agents of translation, right? And the normalization. Okay. So I have a couple of questions related to this, and one that points to your interpretive methodological approach. So the one is this is a process of subjectification, okay, that goes beyond all these. So are there any limits to this process in the way you see this? Is there a point where this stops, or it's being reproduced? The other thing that I was thinking is the second question. You bring together in this context Tajikistan and Russia, okay? It looks to me a shared analytical frame. So do you see these tensions between law expertise as characteristic of the post-Soviet context, or could they be seen as maybe broader transformations of the global migration regime? And the final thing, because again that was triggered in my mind when you said you will focus in your presentation on this particular chapter. So you seem to move between a macro level, all those data with migrants and everything. And then you also pointed today to the individuals, individual actors. So how does this go and develop in your writing process and interpretation process analytically? I mean, how do you breach these different, even in your writing strategies? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yanni. This is wonderful and very complex questions. So I'll try to do justice to them. I think your take on pedagogy of preparedness is very spot on. This is what I was trying to illustrate, that the bureaucracy was basically very much a productive site as the kind of site for politics of representation. What kind of citizens are emerging in this process, and pedagogy was very much looked as technology of rule. It wasn't the kind of meeting citizens' needs, but in the process creating a person who is a migrant, a particular kind of migrant, as a technology of rule, as kind of bureaucratic instrument in itself as well. And the first question was, are there limits to this process? Are there limits to this subjectification? And it's a very kind of it's an interesting question. And to me, the question is about is other kind of national like or independent ways of reinterpreting what is going on. And I have to say that this idea of a migrant is very much the idea of an official, of a bureaucrat. So when you will think about the vernacular's interpretation of migration, it's the suffering subject, it's the person who travels, it's a traveler, it's never a migrant. So there are limits, obviously, to how migrants and their needs and kind of risks are defined. And these are not shared. These are shared bureaucratically, but not very much it's not the subject category which even migrants bought into. Yes, when I worked with people from Central Asia and Russia, they were looking at them as the feeders of the state. The state officials are coming here and we're chipping in money and they're eating plov. We're the ones feeding them. So there were, it's a completely kind of devoid from the, not from the reality, but it's a technological kind of construction, which, and this process of pedagogy, like it was very much not in demand, like amongst migrant workers. So this bureaucracy was very much toothless at the same time. They couldn't capture. But I argue that it is important because it has such a major kind of consequences for how citizens are looked at. And it's here where it's not a national citizen. Like you cannot have a national citizen when you talk about migrants and their problems. It's a global category, which is quite, it has like this very much racialized and colonial understanding of who the person is. And a migrant is unprepared, but a migrant is never at risk of being in debt. A migrant is never at risk of being stranded in winter without a house and just sitting on a bench. So you can see how this kind of framework defines and also limits the bureaucratic tools that could have addressed some of these challenges in migration. But at the same time, it's built for to reinforce kind of Russian legality in Tajikistan. And I read it as a sort of very much post-colonial treatment of the law. And it's to address your second question about, is it kind of post-Soviet situation? And to me, it was rather, I was treating it more as a post-colonial because of the notion of legality. So in this regard, the understanding of what legality is was very much defined in Russia. And I'm working with Paulo Sartoris and his interpretation of how Russia's legislation, Tsarist Russia, was introduced in Central Asia, and what kind of conception of law is being introduced. So it's not a precedent law, yes, if we think about the context in the US, for instance. This law is very much like a canon, like it's more of a Germanic system of the law, where we can talk about the rule by law rather than rule of law. And these mundane bureaucratic practices of teaching Russian law is that the Russian law, like it's there, like it's almost like it's accrues almost this sacred quality, it's the law. and also explains the complete lack of legal activism. But we also can think about like Komarov and Komarov's work on post-colonial legality and how you need this lawfare, you need like this as the nation states emerging, and we can think about Russia as emerging as a nation state, yes, independent of the rest of the Soviet Union, if we can even use this approach of Tajikistan, then the law is one of the kind of instruments where you're crafting this statehood. And I think this is where it comes that you cannot challenge the unjust nature of the law. You can just accept the law as the law there. And with regard to your third question about this moving between different domains, and I think it's grew like through my writing process. So when this research is based on my dissertation research, and my dissertation work is very much this like political economic kind of bird view of the situation, where I try to bring lots and lots of data to illustrate the points. And as I was writing year after year, too long, but anyway, I was more and more kind of focusing on the individuals, like giving space to one or two kind of interlocutors and leaving aside all of this, like the breadth, which I was trying to cover first. Like, look how much I did. Like, look, this is like, it's not just one individual. This is, but as I was writing in the process, I felt that zooming onto individuals was a much more a much more productive analytical entry point, rather than trying to scope with breadth and try to like nail down the argument. I wanted to give my research participants the kind of breadth, so they're not themselves treated as the kind of bureaucrats, as a straw person, but to illustrate the complexity. Like, they understand what is going on, but there are also these institutional repertoires in which they have to operate. And I have one of the protagonists in the book. He was a bureaucrat. He was a migrant worker. He was a Russian soldier. So he was a bureaucrat in the Tajik state. He was a bureaucrat in the international organization and an NGO. So he went through all of them. And it was quite fascinating to see how he was also mobilizing this institutional terminology to narrate his own life, and how he like exited and entered different kind of domains. And I felt this was a more productive approach to look at these broader questions of statehood, of post-colonialism and legality through these individuals. I'm not sure how effective it was, but that my approach was, at least it will make for a better read in the end of the day.
Thank you very much. Great work. Thank you.
Thank you, Yanni.
Dimitri?
Hi, Malika, and thank you for your presentation. I would like to ask something more specific about the legislation in Russia and the situation of acceptance of migrants, even from Tajikistan. If I remember well, in 2006, in Russia, we had the law for the return of for a volunteer return of Satsvenikov, of people who yeah, you understand what I mean. I would like to ask, because after this law, I think Russia didn't put any barriers into migrants to enter and work in Russia. Something that's not happening in Europe, who is creating barriers all over the European borders. So, considering that, let's say the Tajik state and an ex-Soviet state is also applies into this law. Why don't Tajik people, migrants from Tajikistan, don't take this privilege of this law, who give them the full, let's say, even citizenship, even Russian citizenship, I think, right? Why don't they follow this word, this path, and prefer to become travelers and find all these problems in the procedure? Because as you explained it very, very well, and we understand everything from how the legal situation is fluid, is flexible. I mean, the problems of racism and all that, and all that.
Mhm.
But in any case, haven't they thought of taking advantage of this specific law
Yeah.
concerning the resettlement? Thanks a
Mhm.
lot.
Yeah, Dmitry, this is excellent question, and it's actually also led to my second project where I worked on citizenship practices amongst migrant workers. So I would first maybe outline the kind of legal domain of like managing migrants in Russia. And it's mostly, and then we'll turn to citizenship. Like, why don't they turn to other practices? Yes, like why do they tend to stay travelers? So, with regard to the first one, there is a law on entry and exit to the Russian Federation, and this is the kind of the main law which regulates this mobility between visa-free countries. So, in theory, it's easy to go to Russia. But at the same time, if you will take a plane more recently, like if you're with migrant workers standing and trying to enter Russia, you can see how like you can even feel bodily how tense people are. Like it's a very stressful moment on entering into Russian Federation because, as I always say, visa-free mobility does not mean freedom of movement because the entry is heavily regulated. Who can enter, especially if your name is in this blacklist, then you will be denied entry to Russia. And sometimes people didn't know if their names were in the database. I followed all of the laws. I did everything what I supposed to. Why am I on the blacklist? So in this regard, the ease which used to be there, yes, of entry is gone. So when you can reset your entry, you go to Kazakhstan, you come back, and again you're legal again. So these kind of instruments tapered off with time, and especially after 2013. And before 2013, very few people were receiving Russian citizens among migrant workers. Very few. Like there was no need fundamentally. Like, yes, it was challenging to become legal, but at the same time, you can pay bribe here, you can pay bribe here, you can enter, reset your entry, and you can become again legal. So it was a very much flexible field. This changed with the introduction of technology. So this electronic system of accounting, they call it, which tracks all of the people, their movements, and generates this list of blacklisted people. So this is when there was this moment when Russian citizenship became very attractive. This is the moment when it's like, oh, okay, we need to become Russian citizens. At the same time, there are, of course, other reasons to become Russian citizens. There is a whole research on pension reform. But people who I worked with, who worked in Russia in various professions, they were seeking citizenship because of the changes to the legislation, because it became so costly to become legal. And second, you as a migrant worker, you cannot work everywhere where you want to. Like at one point, you cannot trade if you're a migrant worker. You cannot interact with people. So all of the traders in the market, like they can no longer work there. And this is when the citizenship applications skyrocketed. And they were using this program on resettlement of compatriots. Yes, you mentioned Sajid. So when Russia was attracting compatriots, and migrant workers turned to this program because you could be compatriot, you could qualify for Russian citizenship if you know Russian, if you were born in the Soviet Union, yes, if if your parents were even born in Soviet Union. So the program was very much wide. And because of that, Tajikistani migrant workers were particularly actively using the citizenship route after 2013, after law changes, because of the dual citizenship agreement between Tajikistan and Russia. So Tajikistan and Russia, I think in 94 or 96, I'm not sure, I will not be lying, they signed a dual citizenship agreement. And Tajikistani citizens, if they become Russian citizens, they don't lose their Tajikistani citizens. So this is how there was this mass influx to citizenship. Like you had in 2020, 2021, you have 200,000 Tajikistani citizens like naturalizing and becoming Russian citizen. This changed, however, after the Crocus attack and also the terrorist attack in Moscow, which was 2 years ago. And it also changed after the war in Ukraine. So the Russian economic needs changed, but also the far-right elements very much increased their influence in Russia. And this kind of entry to citizenship right now is very much closed for Tajikistani citizens in particular. But when there was this opportunity, there was a rush to receive Russian citizenship. Everyone, like all of my lawyers, like I remember I came to do interview in the NGO, like to visit them again. And I said, oh, I want to interview people who are in the process of receiving Russian citizenship. And they all came, like the whole office came, all of them, literally, like every one of them were there sitting. They're like, go ahead and interview us because we're all receiving Russian citizenship. So that was the scale when like it was like a gold rush.
Thanks a lot, Malika.
Thank you, Dmitry.
Thank you, Malika. Do you have other questions? As far as I can see, we don't. So we can wrap it up here. Thank you very much, Malika, for this presentation. I hope to have your book soon.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really pleasure, and thank you for questions and engagement. It was fun. I quite enjoyed it.
And come and see us in Thessaloniki soon.
Yeah, I will. And this time I will not confuse it. My many apologies. Oh my gosh, I cannot still believe that.
Don't worry. So,
Yeah.
So next week we're going to have the last meeting before Easter, and we're not moving very far from Central Asia, as we're going to have Nicolas Olma to give us a
Oh,
speech.
really?
Yeah.
I'll try also to attend.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.
It's a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.